Life has a strange way of testing boundaries, doesn't it? Sometimes the lines we draw, between right and wrong, love and betrayal, become so blurred that even we can't tell where they begin or end. What I'm about to share isn't easy, but maybe, just maybe, it'll make sense to someone out there. It started on an ordinary afternoon. The kind where nothing much happens, and you think the day will just slip by. I was home, alone, and caught in one of those rare moments of nostalgia. Sorting through old clothes, I found something, a red sundress I hadn't worn in years. It was from a time when confidence came naturally to me, back when I felt alive and unstoppable. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to slip it on. The fabric clung to me in ways it didn't before, accentuating curves I didn't pay attention to anymore. Standing in front of the mirror, I laughed at how daring it still looked. But before I could lose myself in those memories, there was a knock at the door. It was Daniel, my husband's younger brother. He'd recently moved to the city for work, and while he wasn't a frequent visitor, he always found excuses to stop by. That day, he came under the pretext of returning a borrowed toolbox. When I opened the door, his eyes locked on me, not on my face but the dress. His gaze lingered just a beat too long before he smiled, stepping inside as if nothing had happened. "Wow," he said casually, setting the toolbox down. "Didn't know you had this side to you." I felt my cheeks flush. His words weren't inappropriate, but something about the way he said them sent a ripple of unease through me. "It's just an old dress," I replied, trying to downplay the moment. "I was about to donate it." "You should keep it," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "It suits you." There was something in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Daniel had always been charming, but today his charm felt different, more deliberate, almost dangerous. As he moved closer, brushing past me to sit on the couch, I could feel his presence in a way I never had before. It wasn't just his words, it was the way his eyes followed me as I walked across the room. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was overthinking. After all, this was Daniel, my brother-in-law. But then he leaned back on the couch, his gaze unwavering. "You know," he said with a sly grin, "I can see why my brother fell for you. You've got this energy about you." I froze, unsure of what to say. His compliment wasn't outright inappropriate, but the way he said it, the way his eyes held mine, made my pulse race. "Daniel," I said finally, forcing a laugh. "You're flattering me way too much." "Am I?" he asked, his tone shifting, challenging. I tried to shake off Daniel's words, dismissing them as harmless banter. But deep down, I knew they weren't. There was a weight to his tone, an undertone that couldn't be ignored. Still, I plastered on a smile, hoping to keep the conversation light. "Let me grab you a drink," I said, heading toward the kitchen. The air felt too thick to sit still. I needed space to breathe, to think. As I reached for a glass, I heard his footsteps behind me. I hadn't invited him to follow, but there he was, leaning casually against the doorframe, watching me with that same intensity. "You always this nervous, or is it me?" he teased, his lips curving into a smirk. "Nervous? Please," I shot back, trying to sound confident. But the way his eyes stayed locked on me made it hard to keep my composure. He stepped into the kitchen, closer than he needed to be. His presence was overwhelming, magnetic in a way that made me feel both flattered and cornered. "Relax," he said softly. "I'm just messing with you. You know I wouldn't do anything to make you uncomfortable." I turned to face him, determined to put some distance between us. "Daniel, you're my brother-in-law. You know that, right?" His expression didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "I know," he said, his voice low. "And maybe that's the problem." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His words hung in the air, daring me to respond, to acknowledge the line he had just crossed. "Daniel, stop," I said finally, my voice firmer than I expected. "This isn't funny." "I'm not joking," he replied, stepping even closer. I could feel the heat radiating from him, his proximity leaving no room for escape. "You're stunning, you know that? And it's hard to ignore when you're standing right there, looking like that." My heart pounded in my chest as his words sank in. This wasn't harmless flirting anymore. This was dangerous, forbidden. I needed to end it now. "Daniel," I said, my tone sharp, "this is inappropriate. You need to leave." For a moment, I thought he might argue, might push further. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said, stepping back. "I crossed the line. I'm sorry." I watched him walk toward the door, relief washing over me. But just as he reached the hallway, he paused and turned back. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. I meant every word. With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of my kitchen, my thoughts swirling in chaos. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind, over and over, each one more dangerous than the last. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment of weakness on his part. But the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it felt like the start of something I wasn't sure I could control. The next morning, I convinced myself that things would go back to normal. Daniel had apologized, and surely, he understood the gravity of what had happened. But deep down, a part of me knew that wasn't true. As I was sipping my morning coffee, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, and there it was, a message from Daniel. "Morning. I know I messed up yesterday. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could I even say? A part of me wanted to ignore him, to pretend it never happened. But another part, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to know what he had to say. Finally, I typed back, "There's nothing to talk about. Let's move on." His response came almost immediately. "Please, just hear me out. One last time." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a nearby park. It felt safer than having him in my home again. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench with his hands clasped together. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he started, standing as I reached him. "But I can't pretend like it didn't happen. I can't pretend I don't feel something." "Daniel," I said, cutting him off, "this isn't a conversation we should be having. You're my brother-in-law. This is wrong on every level." "I know it's wrong," he admitted, his voice low. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And if I don't say it out loud, it's going to eat me alive." I crossed my arms, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "And then what? What are you expecting me to say?" He took a step closer, his eyes locking with mine. "I don't know. I just needed you to know. Because every time I see you, it gets harder to keep it to myself." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You're putting me in an impossible position," I said quietly. "You need to stop this, Daniel. For your sake and mine." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I don't want to ruin things between us. I don't want you to hate me." "I don't hate you," I said, my voice softening despite myself. "But this can't happen. Whatever you're feeling, you need to let it go." For a moment, he said nothing, just stood there, the weight of his emotions etched on his face. Then finally he nodded. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not going to be easy." I turned to leave, hoping that this would be the end of it. But as I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, the tension between us still palpable. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his expression, the way he looked at me, it all lingered, haunting me in ways I didn't want to admit. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. For a few days, things were quiet. Daniel didn't text or call, and I convinced myself that he had moved on. But just as I started to breathe a little easier, the peace was shattered. It was a Friday evening, and I had just settled in with a glass of wine when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. There he was. Daniel stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I wanted to say no, to shut the door and put an end to whatever this was. But instead, I found myself stepping aside, letting him in. He walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the space as if he were looking for something, or maybe trying to avoid looking at me. "I know I said I'd back off," he began, turning to face me. "But I can't stop thinking about you." "Daniel," I started, shaking my head, "we've talked about this. You need to let it go." "I've tried," he said, his voice firm. "But it's not that simple. Every time I close my eyes, I see you. Every time I'm near you, it feels like I'm supposed to be here." I felt my stomach twist. His words were raw, honest, and they terrified me. "You can't say things like that," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he challenged, stepping closer. "Because it's wrong. Because we're supposed to pretend it doesn't exist? You feel it too, I know you do." I backed up a step, shaking my head. "You're imagining things. I don't feel anything." He didn't stop. Instead, he closed the distance between us, his presence overwhelming. "Look me in the eye," he said, his voice low, "and tell me you don't feel anything when I'm near you." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Because as much as I wanted to deny it, there was a part of me, a small, shameful part, that couldn't ignore the tension between us. "Daniel, this has to stop," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, his tone softening. "But before it does, I need to know, just once." He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I couldn't move. His touch was electric, forbidden, and utterly intoxicating. "Don't," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't pull away. "I won't push," he said, his voice steady. "But tell me to leave and I'll go. Right now. Just say the word." I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The air between us was thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. And in that moment, I didn't say a word. The silence between us was deafening, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to speak. His eyes searched mine, waiting for me to push him away, to tell him to stop. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen in the moment, caught in the pull of something I didn't want to admit. "Say it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tell me to leave." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something else, something far more dangerous. Before I could gather my thoughts, Daniel took a step closer. His hand brushed against my cheek, tentative and soft, as though he were giving me every chance to stop him. "This is wrong," I murmured, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his breath warm against my skin. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" His words sent a shiver through me, and for a moment, I hated myself for not pulling away. I should have stepped back, put an end to it. But instead, I stayed, my heart pounding in my chest as his lips hovered dangerously close to mine. Then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, he kissed me. The world seemed to stop as his lips met mine, soft and searching, like he was testing the waters. It was gentle at first, hesitant, but the moment I didn't pull away, it deepened. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and for a brief, reckless second, I let myself sink into the kiss. But just as quickly as it began, reality came crashing down around me. I pushed him away, my breathing ragged, my mind racing. "We can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "You're right. This has to stop. Right now." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll leave," he said quietly, turning toward the door. But before he left, he glanced back at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said again, and then he was gone. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling. What had I done? How had I let it go this far? The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the memory of his kiss. The way it had felt, wrong, forbidden, and yet so intoxicating. I told myself it was over, that I would never let it happen again. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Days passed, but the memory of that night lingered like a shadow, haunting my every thought. I threw myself into work, into chores, anything to keep my mind busy. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the lingering heat of his kiss or the way my heart had betrayed me in those fleeting moments. And then, just as I thought I could start to move past it, Daniel found a way back into my life. It started with a text. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but I can't stop thinking about you. Please, can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my emotions warring within me. Every logical part of me screamed to ignore him, to delete the message and never look back. But there was another part, a quieter, darker part, that wanted to respond. Against my better judgment, I typed back. "There's nothing to talk about. We both know this has to stop." His reply was instant. "I know, but I just need to see you. One last time. Please." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I knew it was a mistake, but before I could stop myself, I typed, "Fine. Tomorrow. But after that, it's over." When he arrived the next evening, I was prepared to keep my distance, to lay down firm boundaries and put an end to this once and for all. But the moment I opened the door and saw him standing there, all of my resolve began to crumble. He looked at me with that same intensity, his eyes full of emotions I didn't want to name. "Thank you for letting me come," he said, stepping inside. I crossed my arms, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Say what you need to say, Daniel. Then we're done." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know I've made things hard for you," he began, his voice low. "I know I've crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. But I can't take it back, and I can't pretend it didn't happen." "Daniel, we've already talked about this," I said, cutting him off. "There's nothing more to say." "There is," he insisted, taking a step closer. "Because I need you to understand how I feel. This isn't some passing crush or infatuation. It's more than that." "Stop," I said, my voice trembling. "You're making this worse." "I know," he said softly. "But I can't walk away without knowing if you feel it too." His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I wanted to deny it, to shut him down completely. But the truth was, I didn't trust myself to answer. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt the same electric jolt I'd felt that night. "If you tell me to go, I'll go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if there's even a part of you that feels the same, just say it." My heart pounded as I looked into his eyes, torn between what was right and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. And in that moment, I said nothing. The silence between us felt like it stretched on forever. His eyes searched mine, waiting for a sign, any sign, that I might feel the same way. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything. And yet, I didn't pull away. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Just tell me the truth." I swallowed hard, my emotions threatening to betray me. "Daniel," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "This can't happen. You know that." "I know it shouldn't," he said, his hand brushing lightly against mine. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." His words sent a shiver through me, and I hated the way my body responded to his touch. I hated that part of me wanted to close the distance between us, to give in to the pull I'd been fighting for so long. "This isn't about what's real," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It's about what's right. And this isn't right." For a moment, I thought he might back off, that he might finally understand. But instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "What if we didn't have to think about that?" he asked, his voice low and full of longing. "Daniel, stop," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't stop. Instead, he leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from mine. "Tell me to leave," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "And I'll go." My heart raced as I stood there, torn between what I knew was right and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to push him away, to end this once and for all. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, closing the distance that had been teasing us for so long. His lips met mine, and the world seemed to fall away. The kiss was electric, raw, and filled with every ounce of forbidden desire we'd both been holding back. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in the moment, in the sheer intensity of what we were doing. But as quickly as it started, reality came crashing down around me. I pulled away, my breathing ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. "This is wrong," I said, my voice shaking. We can't do this." He looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. I couldn't help it." "You have to go," I said, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside me. "Now." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned to leave. "I'm sorry," he said again, and then he was gone. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. What had I done? How had I let it go this far? I told myself it was over, that I would never let it happen again. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something I couldn't control. The next few days were a blur. I avoided my phone, ignored the doorbell, and buried myself in distractions. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night. His touch, his kiss, it was all I could think about. Then late one evening, there was a knock at the door. My heart sank, knowing exactly who it was. "Daniel," I said as I opened the door, my voice cold. "You shouldn't be here." He looked at me, his eyes heavy with emotion. "I know, but I had to see you. I can't stop thinking about you." I stepped back, shaking my head. "This has to stop. I told you it's over." "Is it?" he asked, stepping inside. "Because I don't think either of us believes that." I turned away, unable to face him. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" "I want the truth," he said, his voice steady. "I want to know if what happened the other night meant anything to you." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure. "It doesn't matter how I feel. This isn't right. It can't happen." "But it did," he said, moving closer. "And we both know it wasn't a mistake." I turned to face him, my frustration boiling over. "It was a mistake, Daniel. A moment of weakness. That's all." "Is that what you really think?" he asked, his voice low. "Because it didn't feel like a mistake to me." His words cut through me, leaving me speechless. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch mine. "I know this is complicated," he said, his voice soft. "But I can't walk away without knowing if there's even a chance." I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "You need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. "You're tearing me apart, Daniel." His expression faltered, but he didn't back down. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "But I can't keep pretending like this isn't real." "It doesn't matter if it's real," I said, my voice breaking. "It's wrong, and it'll destroy everything if we let it continue." For a moment he said nothing, his gaze locked on mine. Then finally he nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. I don't want to hurt you or anyone else. I'll go. Relief washed over me as he turned to leave, but it was short-lived. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. Just know that I meant every word, he said. And if you ever feel the same, I'll be waiting. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. I wanted to believe it was over, that he would leave me alone and we could both move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the end. I thought Daniel would stay away after our last conversation, but I underestimated him. And if I were honest with myself, I underestimated my own feelings. It started subtly. A message here, a quick call there, always with a reason that seemed innocent enough. I found something you left at Mom's house. Or, do you need help with anything around the house? I told myself I was strong enough to handle it, that I could keep things under control. But each interaction chipped away at my resolve. Every time he reached out, the tension between us grew thicker, heavier, and impossible to ignore. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a movie. My phone buzzed, and I saw Daniel's name on the screen. I hesitated before picking up, knowing I shouldn't. Hey, I said, my voice cautious. Hey, he replied, his voice warm and familiar. I know it's late, but I'm outside. Can we talk? I froze, my heart pounding. Daniel, this isn't a good idea. Please, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I just need a few minutes. Then I'll leave, I promise. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. He stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression both hopeful and hesitant. I know I said I'd stay away, he began, stepping inside, but I can't. I've tried and I can't. I crossed my arms, trying to create some distance between us. We've been over this, Daniel. It has to stop. I know what you're saying, he said, moving closer, but I also know what I feel. And I don't think I'm the only one. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was I couldn't. Daniel, I started, my voice trembling, this will ruin everything. Our family, your brother. Everything. I know, he said, his voice low. But when I'm with you, nothing else seems to matter. It's like you're the only thing that feels real. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I hated the way it made my resolve falter. This is wrong, I whispered, more to myself than to him. Then tell me to stop, he said, his voice steady. Tell me to leave, and I will. I looked into his eyes, my heart racing, and for a moment, I was tempted to say the words. To end it all right then and there. But I couldn't. Instead, I stood there frozen as he leaned in. His lips met mine, and the world seemed to fall away. The kiss was urgent, desperate, and completely forbidden. For a moment, I let myself get lost in him. But as the reality of what we were doing sank in, I pulled away, my breathing ragged. This has to stop, I said, my voice shaking. We can't do this. He looked at me, his expression a mix of regret and longing. I know, he said quietly. But I don't know how to let you go. As he left that night, I knew this was a line we couldn't uncross. And while every logical part of me screamed that it had to end, my heart told a different story. I spent the next day in a haze, replaying the events of the night before over and over in my mind. Every moment with Daniel felt heavier, more dangerous, and impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on anything else, chores, errands, even calling a friend to distract myself, but nothing worked. His words, his touch, his kiss, they consumed me, making it harder and harder to pretend that I could resist him. That evening, I resolved to put an end to it once and for all. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between what I knew was right and the pull I felt toward him. But before I could reach out, he beat me to it. There was a knock at the door, soft but deliberate. I hesitated before opening it, already knowing who it was. Daniel stood there, his expression serious. We need to talk, he said. I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked into the living room, his movements tense, as though he was fighting an internal battle. I can't keep doing this, he said finally, turning to face me. I can't keep pretending like this isn't tearing me apart. I crossed my arms, my voice firm. And what do you expect me to do, Daniel? Do you think I'm not struggling to? This is killing me. Then why are we fighting it? He asked, his voice rising with frustration. Why are we trying so hard to deny what's already there? Because it's wrong. I shot back, my emotions spilling over. It doesn't matter how we feel. This will destroy everything. Our family, your brother. Is that what you want? He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto mine. I don't want to hurt anyone, he said, his voice softening. But I can't keep pretending like you don't mean everything to me. I looked away, tears welling in my eyes. Daniel, this can't happen. We both know that. But it already has, he said, his voice trembling. And I think we both know it's not going to go away. The weight of his words hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. I don't know how to fix this, I said finally, my voice breaking. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. Maybe we don't need to fix it, he said quietly. Maybe we just need to figure out how to live with it. His touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I let myself lean into it, let myself feel the depth of what we were both fighting so hard to deny. But then, the reality of our situation came crashing down around me. I pulled away, shaking my head. No, I said firmly. This ends here. Now. His face fell, but he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. If that's what you want, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not about what I want, I said, my voice trembling. It's about what's right. He nodded again, stepping toward the door. I'll leave, he said. But just know, I'll never stop caring about you. As the door closed behind him, I felt a wave of relief and sorrow wash over me. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. The days that followed were quiet, almost unbearably so. Daniel kept his distance, and I threw myself into rebuilding my life, trying to find a way to move on. Eventually, the ache began to fade. The memories of him became less vivid, less consuming. And while I would always carry the weight of what had happened, I knew I had made the right choice. Because some lines are meant to stay uncrossed.